first of all, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dan, for joining us today. Now, you don't need much of an introduction for most of our audience, but for those of you who don't know you, Dan is a writer, journalist, and president of the Initiative for Free Trade, a not-for-profit organization that makes the intellectual and moral case for free trade. He was also MEP for South East England until the campaign that he led, asking Britain to get him out of his job, finally succeeded. I thought I'd also say a few quick words introducing myself and explaining how the event is going to go. My name is Andres Moral. I'm the Regional Director at Students for Liberty, UK and Ireland. And Students for Liberty UK is a network of student societies across the UK promoting the ideas of liberty in all respects, civil, academic, and economic freedom. So if you're interested, please join the classical liberal or libertarian society on your campus, or if we're not present on your campus, you can apply to become a local coordinator at localcoordinators.org, and we will help you set up your society. We're also looking for national positions for pretty much everything from managing social media to writing articles or graphic design. So if you think you have a skill and you want to help the cause of liberty in the UK, particularly in the student community, please apply at localcoordinators.org. For anything else, please do not hesitate to contact me. We have a Facebook page, Students for Liberty UK, and a Twitter page at Students for Liberty UK. About the event, I will be speaking to Dan for about 40 minutes, and it will be followed by a Q&A. You can submit your questions via the Q&A box if you're here on Zoom, and if you're on Facebook, you can put your questions in the comments. But one thing I ask, please keep the questions as short as possible because I have to read them live and I don't want to drown in the past. So before we start with the interview proper, I think you have a really nice bookcase behind you. Any books the Twitter police shouldn't see?
Well, thank you, Andres. Buenas tardes, and buenas tardes to everyone watching from the UK or from further afield. And before we come onto my bookshelf, let me just say I want to reiterate and emphasize what Andres just said about Students for Liberty. It's been a huge pleasure for me to be on the international board of Students for Liberty for some years. And back in the days when we could still travel internationally, I tried always to make a point, any country I was in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, to stop and do an event with the local Students for Liberty and to learn from them a different take on the politics of whichever country I was in than was the typical discourse. But as for my bookshelf, I've been spending a bit more time, like a lot of people, I guess, with my books, but I think probably what you can see just above me there is all the Shakespeare, which is always what sustains me more than any of the political tomes, especially at times like this.
Great. So yeah, well, if anyone's interested, you can find Dan's talks for Students for Liberty on YouTube. And yeah, thank you so much for all the work you've done for the liberty movement in general and Students for Liberty in particular throughout the years. So the topic that we're here to discuss today is how to get out of this mess. I think we could start at the beginning when with the situation we saw when China locked down, then in Europe, Italy locked down, and then we saw this very unexpected domino effect of countries locking down one after the other. Now we've heard arguments defending the lockdowns, these for some extreme restrictions of civil liberties, usually presenting this dichotomy between saving lives and saving the economy. But I think you may have somewhat of a different view, Dan. So where do you stand on all this?
Well, I think the way you put it there, Andres, as a domino effect is a telling and useful one. It's worth standing back and asking how we have ended up with a policy which none of the advisory groups had considered. You know, Britain, like every country, or like every developed country, has medical advisors who have war gamed specifically these kinds of epidemics, and none of them ever considered a mass quarantining of the entire population. Nobody ever thought that that would be a proportionate reaction. Even in the imperial model, contrary to popular belief, there is no suggestion of a total lockdown, right? So how did we end up with this policy that nobody had countenanced until immediately before it happened? And I think the answer may have to do with the accident of how the disease spread. So China locked down Wuhan because China is a communist dictatorship and they lock people up at the drop of a hat. It's a very natural thing for them to lock people up. Then the first outbreak in Europe was in Italy. And if you cast your mind back, you remember the Italian government had this plan to try and have a regional quarantine of the infected area. But then word of that plan leaked and people started heading out of that area to go to central or southern Italy. And so the government there then imposed a general lockdown, which nobody had really considered until then. And it then became a domino effect. And I've been of the view throughout that it is disproportionate. Not that we should do nothing. I don't think anyone's arguing that, but that the coercive powers that we've given to the state are excessive, and that the impact, both in terms of lost liberty and lost livelihood, is, and when we're through this, we'll know for sure, but is likely to be shown to have been disproportionate, not useless, but excessive. Why do I say that? Well, the first thing is, when the domino effect hit Britain, we were already pursuing a policy of social distancing, right? So that the week our lockdown was declared on the 23rd of March, and the week leading up to it, if you like, we were pursuing the kind of policy that a small state conservative should favor, which was relying on people's common sense, trusting people to use their discretion, having, yes, some legal restrictions, the theatres and the pubs were closed and so on, but in general, people were trusted to do the right thing. And then that policy was suddenly dropped, I think, for one of two reasons, or maybe a combination. First, there was a general clamor for a much more restrictive policy. Media were demanding it because policy is contagious as well as viruses. So that why, France has locked down, Spain has locked down, Italy has locked down. Why are we allowing people to wander around like this? Right? And that was overwhelmingly the tone of the media, and I think, in fairness, of the public. I think those media were reflecting the opinions of their readers and viewers. And then, of course, there was this Imperial College report, which I think has now been very significantly devalued by the people looking at how it was coded and how it was put together. But as more to the point, I think been shown to have serious flaws by the failure of the epidemic to follow the extreme path that it predicted in the countries that didn't lock down. So if you apply the imperial model's numbers to Sweden, which, if you like, stuck with the policy that Britain had had between the 16th and the 23rd of March, you'd expect there to be 30,000, 40,000 deaths by now. And of course, there haven't been. So it's starting to look, I don't want to overdo this. It's early, and I put up there right at the front, I'm not any kind of virologist or pathologist or epidemiologist. I have no medical qualifications, whatever. But all those charts we've been looking at with the rise and fall, it's beginning to look as though the strictness of a lockdown is not the determining factor of how quickly the disease passes its peak. And I think we can see that even if you do fairly like with like comparisons, right? So obviously, East Asian countries that didn't have such a severe lockdown have come out of this better than Europe. But I think you could validly point out that there are lots and lots of differences there. They were scarred by their experience of SARS. They were more prepared. They wore face masks, etc., etc. But if you do relatively fair like-with-like comparisons, for example, between those US states that had strict lockdowns and those that had short or no lockdowns, or between otherwise comparable European countries, Spain and Italy had very, very strict lockdowns. Germany and the Netherlands, much milder ones. Sweden, none at all. And yet you can't really find much correlation. Yeah, sure, there's some. Of course, if you act early, there's some correlation. But it may well be that there are other factors here that are more important. Demographics, population density, climate, geography, I mean, all sorts of other things. It's human nature always to put human action at the center of everything, but very often we're not as important and governments are not as important. In his book about atheism, Richard Dawkins identifies this kind of, let's call it this anthropocentric fallacy of ours, this tendency always to make everything about human behavior. And he blames it for the rise of religion. He says, our remote ancestors would respond to a disaster like a plague or an earthquake or whatever. They couldn't accept that a really bad thing, that something that terrible might just happen on its own. It had to be about sin. And it had to be, therefore, something that was susceptible to being improved or ameliorated by human behavior. Or if it wasn't the sin of the whole population, then let's find some religious minority, or witches or Jews or Catholics or Protestants or whatever, right? We think we've moved on, but actually we tend to blame politicians as though they had that power in exactly the same way that our ancestors would blame these groups. And I just wonder whether a year from now we're going to look back and say, well, this followed the same sort of trajectory as Asian flu or Hong Kong flu, or indeed, I feel bound to say, since you're in Madrid, the misnamed Spanish flu of 1918. They burned themselves out. And it may well be that when we look back, it will be pretty clear that the severity of these lockdowns was excessive. But you know what? No one will want to accept that, because we're all prone to this kind of sunk costs fallacy that makes us deeply reluctant to accept that all the sacrifices might have been in vain.
So you mentioned there that part of the problem here might have been the public reaction to this pandemic. And we may excuse in general the public for perhaps over-accusing this rise and falls to our behavior and whether we need or not a lockdown. But how can a government that's been paid to do this and should have prices, why are they not performing the sort of serious cost-benefit analysis that I think most of the so-called skeptics of lockdown are actually arguing for? I think no one, as you said, is actually arguing for no measures at all. I think just arguing for an actual analysis of whether this is working or not, and whether we are actually putting this on balance. And so why do you think we've gone for this extreme measures? And particularly, how can this be solved for future pandemics?
I think that's a very good question. And you're right. Very, very few people are arguing that everything should carry on as normal. I say very few people. I think the dictator of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, is arguing that, it's a disease that's only hits degenerate Westerners and homosexuals and others. We tough Belarusians are immune. But other than him, and he has eccentric views on a lot of subjects, if you like, the skeptical position is not that there's nothing to worry about at all. It's that once you do what Sweden is doing, what Britain was doing for the week prior to the lockdown, which is avoiding unnecessary journeys, avoiding big meetings, washing your hands all the time, etc., you are into diminishing returns. And I think if you look at our the one thing we have as clear data are the fatality rates. We can see when they peaked. They peaked on the 8th of April. If you extrapolate with the same lead time that all of the models, including the Imperial College one, assume, then the disease must have peaked in the UK on or around the 18th of March. In other words, 5 days before, sorry, not the disease peaked, the rate of infections peaked 5 days before the lockdown was emerged. So that is the position. Now, why is that such an unpopular thing to say, right? It should be a fairly boring technical argument among expert epidemiologists, right? Instead of which it's become a kind of angry culture war. And I think the answer is that, first of all, people are bad at assessing risk. People are naturally risk averse to a degree that generally is excessive. That is a very, very well observed phenomenon that behavioral psychologists have been aware of for decades, right? We're descended from hunter-gatherers who lived in a much more dangerous world than we do. And they were attuned to risk for good reasons, that they were much more at risk than we are. But we still have their genome, so we're on a trigger for anything that looks dangerous. And especially something that seems to be a collective threat, such as a disease. It flicks switches in our brains. It makes us more, if you like, more like Trump supporters. It makes us more authoritarian. It makes us more intolerant of dissent. It makes us more patriotic. It makes us more suspicious of foreigners. It makes us more suspicious of foreign imports. You know, that's our inner caveman. Those are our ancient Paleolithic genomes saying, avoid strangers because they may carry pathogens. Keep your kids close, you know, hoard food, turn inwards. But actually they're generally pretty bad policy prescriptions. So for example, to take the obvious one, the almost universal shift towards relative protectionism as a result of the epidemic. The number of people in every country, in Europe, in Britain, in America, in China, in South America, saying, this shows that we can't depend on imports. We need to be more self-sufficient. We need to grow more of our own food. Again, that's our inner caveman. It sounds completely plausible until you actually stop and think about it, right? The one thing that has worked brilliantly throughout this epidemic is trade in necessary products, including food. You know, in Britain, April is what farmers call the hungry gap. Okay, it's the time when we're producing almost nothing. So we have winter vegetables, we have turnips and cabbages and potatoes and so on. They've run out, and the first harvests haven't yet begun. Okay, so the virus hit just when we are most dependent on imported food, right? Other than rhubarb and asparagus and maybe purple sprouting broccoli and some nettles, we really don't produce anything at that time of year, nothing, right? And you know what? It didn't matter. You know, we were able to carry on importing, you know, Spanish onions and so on, New Zealand lamb, etc. Just as we were able to import face masks, gloves, ingredients for potential vaccines or cures, right? No country, if you think about it, is going to be happening to be sitting on all of those things at any given moment. We don't know what they're going to need the next time there's an emergency, right? So the way to have security is not to produce everything yourself. The way to have security is to have a very diverse source of different suppliers so that you can always find what you need from somewhere. And that is a difficult argument to make even in normal times. But at a time like this, it is an almost impossible argument to win. And I'm afraid if you look at the incentives for politicians who are responsive to public opinion, sensitive to what their constituents want, think of the incentives for them. No government is going to be voted out of office for erring on the side of caution. erring, by the way, being the correct word, right? The public mood is better safe than sorry. Politicians know that. So if you are a minister, or indeed an advisor, a medical advisor on one of these committees, you would rather spend billions on something that you suspect is probably useless than run the tiniest risk of being accused of not doing enough. And that's true whether we live in a dictatorship or a democracy, right? All the incentives in this situation are towards an overreaction. And so I'm afraid that that's what we're getting. There's no point in blaming politicians. You know, the old chestnut has it that in a democracy, you get the leaders you deserve. I think we're getting exactly the policies that people want. And for those of us who believe in personal autonomy and freedom, it is an uncomfortable reminder of what a small minority we are.
So yeah, you mentioned there. Well, we'll go back to the millions being spent in a second, but one of the things that you mentioned there is how this crisis makes us, well, Trumpier, or as you just mentioned, or you mentioned in your column for the Washington Examiner. And do you think that, well, this distrust of foreign nations that we are seeing in the general public right now, that it will cause a decline in liberal principles after this crisis, and what can we do to avoid that if that's the case?
Yes, I'm afraid that is my fear. It's visibly already happening. You know, an epidemic flicks switches in our brains. It makes us warier. That's really what I mean by Trump here. More suspicious of immigration, of terrorism, of crime, whatever. It's more scared, right? And especially one like this, especially a bug like this that you know emerged in a dodgy communist dictatorship, and where the liberal elites try to dismiss concerns about it as racism. All of that, if you like, makes people Trumpier, and Trumpier unfortunately means more hostile to unrestricted trade. And I think that is going to be a real danger as the world comes out of this. If I think of what happened after the financial crash, you know, of 2008, I remember thinking then that there is going to be a lot of inflation after this because of the amount of money that was created and pumped into the system by governments all over the world. You know, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Fed, the Bank of Japan, they all responded in similar ways. And that actually didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen is because globalization continued to drive down prices. So probably, you know, by less than it would have done had it not been for all the quantitative easing. But still, if you like, globalization is such a powerful force that it was able to absorb the massive money printing that we saw a decade ago. Now, this time we've seen even more massive money printing, and by and large, a good rule of thumb is that if you look at what's happened on stock exchanges, they have rebounded by pretty much the exact same amount as has been pumped into them by governments. Again, you'd think that must mean that whether it's now or 3 years down the line, there is going to be massive inflation. The difference between 10 years ago and now is that I'm not sure we are going to be able to rely on the globalization. Even before the crisis hit, we were seeing a degree of mercantilism in Beijing, in Brussels, and in Washington. And I think that the biggest danger to a recovery is going to be a general desire for each country to build up its own industries. And you know, we're going to be doing that just when we can least afford to do it, just when we've adopted all of this extra debt and when so many people have lost livelihoods. That the real danger of a shutdown like this is how long it takes to get out of it. You know, restrictions are much more easy to impose than to lift, and you know, you will know the Spanish saying that only the only the contingent is permanent, only the temporary becomes permanent, right? Or as Milton Friedman used to put it, nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program, right? We could be stuck with a lot of these controls for years, for decades after this. And I don't say decades lightly. There's been a lot of comparisons to the Second World War in Britain, and obviously some of those comparisons are improper, but some of them are quite accurate in the sense that during a general mobilization, you accept things that you wouldn't accept in normal times. But the scary thing about that parallel is how slow we were to lift those restrictions after 1945. You know, we didn't get rid of identity cards until 1952. We didn't get rid of rationing until 1954. We still had military conscription until 1960. And when it comes to the economic controls that were imposed supposedly for the emergency of the war, frankly, most of them lasted until the Thatcher reforms. And in the case of education and healthcare, we're still broadly operating to early 1940s models. So this is the real danger, that a degree of not just of indebtedness, but of state coercion that was brought in supposedly for a very unique one-off emergency will end up lasting for a long time coming out of it, which is just the way to impede an economic recovery.
So obviously we've seen this lockdown in different degrees throughout Europe, across Europe. And well, it is clear not all countries have reacted in this same way. And that seems to have caused a lot of tensions in Europe, particularly with Sweden not imposing the lockdown. And in the EU, we also had the Eurobonds crisis with Italy and Spain accusing Germany and the Netherlands of a lack of solidarity and killing the European idea. What do you make of this, and who do you think are the winners and losers in this lockdown situation?
It's a very interesting thing. I mean, I think the criticism of Sweden is telling in two ways. First of all, it is striking that the tone of the critics is very revealing. They want Sweden to fail, which is, I know that sounds shocking, but I can't see how else we should interpret all of these headlines pointing gleefully to the death rate in Sweden. Now, you know, you have a higher fatality rate in Spain. We have a higher fatality rate in the UK than they have in Sweden. And yet there is this almost ghoulish willing for Sweden to fail. Why? Again, sunk costs, right? Because if Sweden succeeds, it will be difficult to deny that a lot of the rest of the world acted unnecessarily. And people will have to face up to the horrible idea that we destroyed lives and livelihoods for nothing, that actually it wouldn't have made that much difference. Now, the other thing that's really telling about the attacks on Sweden is that a higher initial death rate was always, if you like, baked in. It was part of the assumption that the Swedish epidemiological authorities made, right? And why that is revealing is it shows that no one ever really understood what was meant by flattening the curve, which was the original justification for these restrictions everywhere, right? So the justification for this unprecedented quarantine, I mean, you know, normally you require a very high burden of proof before incarcerating people, right? But we've incarcerated entire populations on the basis that we needed to buy time. That was the argument. You know, squash the sombrero is how Boris brilliantly put it. Squash the sombrero. In other words, don't allow the peak to overwhelm our medical capacity. Don't allow people to be dying needlessly for want of intensive care beds or ventilators or whatever. But of course, the distinction between preventable deaths and deaths per se has broken down. So people failed to understand that if you're squashing the sombrero, the shaded area under the graph is going to be the same. It's just more spread out, right? So Sweden's calculation was always that there would be a higher initial spike and then a higher recovery and a much quicker move towards a general immunity, right? Now, maybe that will be true, maybe it won't be true. But the daily attacks all over the world in media on Sweden suggest that people have simply not understood what that meant, or at least they're pretending not to understand that flattening the curve doesn't reduce the overall number of fatalities. Sweden's are going to come earlier and tail off earlier. That's the first point. But I think your other question about the euro is a really interesting one. It's, you know, never fall into the trap of anthropomorphizing a virus, right? When people say the virus is getting tired or whatever, or the virus wants you to do this, right? But so be careful of the be careful to limit the metaphor. But if the virus had been expressly trying to hurt the euro, it would have hit Italy, and it would have hit the productive bit of Italy, i.e. precisely that part of northern Italy where it struck. You know, the bizarre thing is that if the economic consequences of the infections had been worse for Germany and the Netherlands than for Spain and Italy, that paradoxically would have helped the euro. That would have evened it out a little bit. But by acting in the way that it has, the virus has exacerbated and exaggerated the tensions of the imperfect zone within which the single monetary policy is being applied. And it's done so, I mean, as we were saying earlier, these external threats, these scares make people more introverted, more nationalistic. The EU, I think, has just shown itself to be a lot less relevant than it was before all this began. So I'm not one of those people who thinks the EU is going to fail or fall apart tomorrow. I've never believed that. Too many people have too much invested in it, you know, even in the most direct financial way. But I think that the EU is now going to dwindle and become a sort of creaky, titular, historical entity, a bit like the late Holy Roman Empire. It will no longer have the momentum that it's had until now.
So moving away from the EU and moving into UK politics, well, the major economic response led by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, had the visible goal of retaining jobs through the furlough scheme and the bounce back loans. I guess most of the audience is already familiar with those. Just a quick recap. These were measures designed for a short-term lockdown. Now, the UK has been in lockdown for over 2 months, and we finally start to see the end, but we've reached the point of having over a quarter of the workforce furloughed, and about 1 million businesses receiving loans and other kinds of support. And the national debt is now at something like 98% of GDP. So do you think it has attained the goals that it set out, despite the high cost? And do you think that these measures will perhaps have some unintended consequences?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very good question. Had the shutdown been very brief, had it been 2 or 3 weeks, then the furlough scheme would have looked like a stroke of genius. It wouldn't have been long enough to have distortive effects, and most businesses could have just taken that hit and recovered. It would have been a one-off loss that they'd have written off, and it would have been a little bit tougher, but everything would have got back to normal. The trouble is that the longer this goes on, the more businesses will give up. I mean, we'll have to give up. They will be driven into insolvency. I can see it happening around me. We all anecdotally know of cases where it's happening. And the trouble is that once, you know, we were all looking at those graphs that looked as though they were going exponential of the infections. Mercifully, they've now turned into bell curves. But the thing that is still going exponential is the bankruptcies, because, you know, a 2-month lockdown is not twice as bad as a 1-month lockdown. It's far, far worse than that, because every business that fails has knock-on effects. And I think it's now becoming clear that although the furlough scheme here is optimistically called the job retention scheme, and although it will be that in a few cases, for a lot of people, it is a kind of deferred unemployment. We could be looking at 2-3 million unemployed after this. And my worry is that when businesses are allowed to reopen, because so many other businesses will have closed and so many people will be feeling financially worse off, there will be fewer customers for them anyway. And that's when you get into a spiral. So we need to be taking some really urgent remedial action just to keep the heartbeat of the patient going, right? Or maybe a better medical metaphor would be that we're trying to, we put the economy into an induced coma 9 weeks ago, and we now need to ensure that it comes back to health, and we need to do that swiftly and safely. And I think that means, above all, a focus on making it easier for firms to invest and to hire people. And that means we should consider things that we normally wouldn't consider. Scrapping stamp duty, suspending corporation tax or cutting it to a much lower level. Above all, suspending capital gains tax. That would hugely encourage people to. There are very few other encouragements for them to invest at a time like this. And at the same time, suspending the national insurance, getting rid of payroll taxes, making it as cheap as possible for companies to take people on. Because when the furlough scheme is tapered out, a lot of firms are going to find that they have to let people go, and that risks becoming an avalanche unless we can incentivize people to retain or to take on new jobs. And the furlough scheme, of course, is unsustainable. Quite apart from the direct cost of it, our economy is going to be changed in lots of ways. Everyone's is. There's going to be a much greater shift to online retail and so on. Paying people 80% of their salary not to do their previous job is no way to encourage people to move into the areas that can hire quickly. So we're going to need to look at some things that we normally wouldn't do. And this is going to push up the debt even more, right? I know a lot of people will say, you can't afford a tax cut at a time like this. We've got a debt of 100% of GDP. We're going to borrow 300 billion this year. It's a worse recession than we've ever known before. How can we make the fiscal position even worse? Surely we need to raise taxes to try and get back to sort of order. I mean, of course, over the long term, we need to bring the budget back into balance. But tax rises now will kill the patient. In fact, let me make this nod to Keynesians. As well as cutting taxes, we should be bringing forward spending on infrastructure projects and so on. I think it's a bit of a myth that Keynes said we should pay people to dig holes in the road. I mean, he didn't write that. He may have said it. We don't know. I don't think he did. But looking around me in this rather pretty part of rural England, there are plenty of existing holes in the road, right? And councils are saying, well, we don't have the budget to fill them. Well, do you know what? Spend next year's budget on them, for heaven's sake. Now is the time to be doing all of that, because we need to be ensuring that there is still some heartbeat there until the economy can recover fully.
So another thing on top of Britain getting restrictions out of the way to make employment easier, another of the things that you've mentioned could help now is promoting free trade to boost our economy. However, a lot of your critiques will just say that you've been promoting and helping the UK to leave one of the major free trading blocs, the EU. However, I know that you often talk about the concept of the Anglosphere. So I wanted to ask you, do you see the Cansec project as a replacement or even improvement on EU membership? And do you think it could be an effective way of boosting the economy after this pandemic?
It's a very good question. So I'm in favor of free trade with everybody, including, for the avoidance of any doubt, the European Union. And if the EU, for political reasons, refuses, as it's currently doing, to have the kind of trade deal with Britain that it has with Canada or South Korea or whoever, then we should still, in my view, remove barriers to imports. That's the big gain of trade. I know it's a difficult and counterintuitive point, and it took me a long time to see that. And when I was a student, I didn't think this, and I needed to have it explained to me and to read it a few times before I finally accepted it. But it makes intuitive sense that you should be trying to export as much as you can and build up surpluses, and that's how you get rich. And that was the thinking globally until the 19th century. But it really doesn't work like that. And when you look at how the experience of real countries, you see that actually removing barriers to imports is the key. That exports are the stuff you're trying to get rid of. And so we would replicate, I think, 80% of the advantages of a free trade agreement with the EU simply by unilaterally accepting EU goods and services. The other 20% being mainly, if you like, standards and non-trade, non-tariff issues. But there's a really big, important difference between the EU and most other trade blocs, which is that because the EU was fundamentally a political rather than an economic project, and because trade was always seen as a way of bolstering the goal of political amalgamation, of merging all the institutions together, the EU, unlike NAFTA or EFTA or ASEAN, instead of being a free trade area, went down the road of being a customs union and inhibiting its members' trade with non-members, right? Now, customs unions make sense as a form of political union, because if you like, the whole point of them is that they artificially redirect their member states' trade towards each other. Customs unions are therefore quite unusual. They're not the preferred model of classical economists, and they're fairly rare globally. You normally get them when one country effectively runs another. Swaziland is in a customs union with South Africa because it doesn't operate its own international trade policy, right? The Palestine is in a customs union with Israel for similar reasons. The main, other than the EU, the two main examples of a customs union in the world are Mercosur, because Mercosur was created basically by the EU. It's a really fascinating story, the extent to which EU governments and EU embassies and the European Commission itself and allied organizations like the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and so on poured money into trying to create Mercosur as a customs union with a parliament and all the rest of it. The EU loves to replicate itself around the world to export its ideology. And then the other main example is Vladimir Putin's, right? The Eurasian Union, the customs union of Belarus and Kazakhstan and so on. And again, the objective there is political. He wants those countries to be closer to each other. So Britain, if you like, the EU is the odd man out here, because there's no reason why Britain could not simultaneously be a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and EFTA and the US, Mexico, Canada. It could do all of those things, but it can't do that while being a member of the EU, because the EU insists on exclusivity. And that was always one of the reasons why I thought that in the long run, the EU had the wrong model. And I think that's going to become clearer with every passing year as the EU's share of the world economy continues to shrink.
So the alternative to the EU model seems to be that sort of idea that underpins the whole Anglosphere project, that idea of mutual recognition of standards. And in the same way that the EU likes to sort of replicate their own model, do you think that the British model is replicable even in places where they don't have that those characteristics that you normally mention, that namely Protestant ethic, the island geography, the common law, and that consistent rejection of extremism that we see?
Yeah, so that's That's a very good question, Andres. So again, I am in favor of free trade with everyone. I want free trade with Vietnam. I want free trade with Ecuador. I want free trade with Mali. Right? You know, free trade is always and everywhere a good thing. It always makes all of the participants richer. The extra ingredient that we're talking about when we look at the Anglosphere countries is basically greater regulatory compatibility, which makes it much easier to move to a kind of mutual recognition. If you think of what mutual recognition is, it's basically an agreement to trust the other country's regulations. So the EU model, and most economic models in the world, are based around the idea of some common regulations, some shared standards. You know, if I want to sell you a car, then this is what both sides have to agree goes into it. These are the emissions levels. This is how the headlight works, etc., etc. Whereas mutual recognition basically says, look, we trust you. If you call it a car, that's good enough for us, right? We don't need any extra tests because we think you're a good country with good regulatory systems in place, and we don't think you want to kill your own citizens. If you sell us a defective car, of course, it'll still be, you know, the company that sells it will still be liable just as one of ours would be, right? So we're trusting our own legal system to go after any foreign company just as it would a domestic one. So we don't think we need any additional regulations. That's the mutual recognition model rather than the standardization model. And although you can, of course, have mutual recognition with Ecuador or Vietnam or Mali, it makes sense, especially for a service country, to start with the countries that have the most interoperable systems. So when we look at the common law English-speaking countries, Singapore, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, United States, Hong Kong, you know, some of the Caribbean states, arguably South Africa, you find that it's the same. It's not just the same language. It's the same accountancy rules. It's the same. You know, the lawyers, the doctors, the architects tended to get the same qualifications in the same places very often, and because they have a common law system which is based around property rights, decentralization, and not having long prescriptive rules, they can operate even to the extent of recognizing each other's precedent in each other's legal systems as they do. And that's for me the immediate appeal of having a deep, comprehensive Anglosphere trade agreement based on mutual recognition. I don't call it a trade bloc because it wouldn't be a bloc, it would be a network.
Okay, so starting with the questions from the public here. One of the questions that we've received starts, the British public has been very bullish on the lockdown, limiting the government's ability to do the policy it thinks best. What do you think coronavirus has taught us about democracy and the role of public opinion?
Yeah, well, it is worth always remembering that, for want of a better word, libertarianism is a very minority creed. There is an authoritarian streak in every electorate, including in Britain, and it is inflamed at times of crisis. There was a wonderful book that came out, a very short book, a couple of years ago called Tribe by an American writer called Sebastian Junger. And he looked at, among other things, he interviewed a lot of people who'd been through the siege of Sarajevo and the war in Bosnia. And a common theme of their recollections is that they missed the sense of solidarity and simplicity and purpose. Of course, they didn't miss the war itself. They didn't want to be shot at again, but they definitely felt alive in a way that they hadn't done since. And one of the reasons that he suggests that this is the case is that kind of crisis, which brings out people's sense of community and tribalism, brings us much closer to our kind of caveman pasts. You know, So at times like this, you tend to have fewer cases of depression, fewer cases of suicide. You have, and I'm a libertarian, and I dislike the extent to which these rules have been imposed on us. But I'm not. That doesn't mean that I can't understand why people are attracted by this greater sense of kind of neighborliness. And I feel it myself in my village. Suddenly, everyone is, every neighbor is like a family member now rather than a stranger. As well as bringing out the prissy, coercive, authoritarian, bossy side of people, it also brings out a very generous side of people, and they're all, going out of their way to look after each other and so on. So that's, if you like, the attraction of authoritarianism. And the thing that most people won't see is that doesn't require laws. That you can get the good aspects of community without needing state prohibitions on everything. It's very interesting. My friend Ryan Bourne at the Cato Institute made a really good observation a few weeks into this crisis, where he said, everyone says it's a crisis for libertarian conservatives, but it's actually much more of a crisis for communitarian conservatives. The libertarians have stuck to what was already a minority view, but nothing has happened to destroy that worldview. But all the people, all those kind of self-consciously Burkean Tories who said, community and togetherness and solidarity, but that doesn't have to be the state. The moment the crisis came, they were the loudest demanding more state coercion. And they've now found themselves backing this weird alliance of big tech and big government as the way of getting out of it. And I can't think of any moment during the infections when my, if you like, trad conservative friends, who are good, selfless, kind people, often quietly religious people, they're all, they genuinely are good friends of mine, but I can't think of one moment when they've said, this is an important thing, but it shouldn't be the government that takes the lead. And that's a reminder again of just how fragile individualism is as a creed.
So another question coming from Facebook now, Ignacio Perinat asks, Mr. Hannan, do you believe private health services have done a better job than public ones? Has excessive government power hindered effectiveness in the health sector to combat COVID-19?
Well, one obvious advantage that Germany had was that they made testing and tracing a private sector initiative from the beginning. And I think that decision has been vindicated by the results. There is a certain paradox, a certain doublethink in Britain, that people simultaneously say, we love our NHS, turn out and applaud it every week, and then in the same breath say, why can't we be more like Germany or South Korea or whichever country has done well that week? And very, very few people draw the obvious inference, which is that maybe we have something to learn from the healthcare models pursued by South Korea or Germany or Singapore, or indeed almost any country. State monopolies tend to be inefficient and creaky and unresponsive. And NHS procurement and Public Health England are no exception. But a bizarre kind of media convention dictates that whenever people criticize the failures of the NHS or the public health authorities on things like inability to get gloves and masks and so on, they always refer to them as the government, right? As though somehow there was some group of evil cabinet ministers, sadistically intervening to prevent procurement, because they have to maintain this double think that the NHS is beyond criticism, and yet why isn't it performing as well as mixed systems? And I don't see any sign of that ending, I'm afraid. We want to have, we complain about our relative underperformance compared to other countries, but it's still absolutely forbidden to say that those countries have a better system than we do.
So another question from the public that I think is probably, well, not very related to this issue in particular, but probably generally good for the people listening today that might not be acquainted with libertarianism. What does liberty mean to you?
Well, I think it's difficult to improve on J.S. Mill's definition, right? That freedom means being allowed to do your own thing in your own way, provided you do not impinge upon that freedom in someone else. And sounds simple when you say it like that, but the implications are huge. It would mean undoing an awful lot of what governments do the world over if we truly applied personal liberty, private property, free contract, and the rest of it. I think it works. You know, it works brilliantly in terms of it always makes people richer. The countries that do that furnish their citizens with a higher level of prosperity. But it also makes people happier. It was that creed that brought the end of the slave states and the serfdom and the other forms of coercion and oppression that we'd had for 10,000 years, and allowed everyone a fair chance in life. I just make one additional observation about it. I did a broadcast the other day, which is now available at their website with the IEA, talking about John Milton, the author of Paradise Lost, the great 17th century poet. And he, in many ways, was the sort of first real libertarian. He got in just a little bit before Locke, and what's really cool about him is that, you know, his libertarianism was a sideline. He was basically a poet. It's just that when he expressed views, they were all brilliant. But he drew a distinction between what he called liberty and what he called license. License meant just freedom to do what you want, whereas liberty meant exercise of rational thought for virtuous ends. His point was, anyone, you know, an animal is free to do what it wants, but you wouldn't really say it has liberty because it hasn't got a conscience. It hasn't been able to think through the consequences of its actions. And there is a kind of freedom for human beings that is like the animal, that is just giving into your appetites. And then there's a kind that is based on using your faculties. And I think that it's important to stress that all the time. Libertarianism is not a simple kind of creed of irresponsibility. On the contrary, it emphasizes people's personal responsibility precisely because it doesn't allow us to throw it on society and say, you know, it's for other people to make the rules. I just do what I'm told.
So we're running out of time here. Would you have time for a couple more questions?
We'll do a couple of quick ones. Yeah, I've got to go in about 5 minutes.
All right. Okay, quickly. Your colleague, George Walding, asked, China's culpability in the pandemic is tremendous. Going forward, should we continue to trade as we have been doing, or should we take this as an opportunity to have a reset?
It does seem that China has been culpable, at the very least, of understating the threat in the early stages. So China has behaved badly, and I think there should be recourse. I've never believed that economic sanctions are an effective way of expressing your disapprobation with a regime that you don't like. And if you think about it, refusing to trade is just an economic sanction, right? Refusing to sign a trade deal is a weak form of economic sanctions. You don't need to have a blockade to call it sanctions. The problem with sanctions is they never really work. They always end up hitting the wrong people. They hit ordinary people in your own country, they hit ordinary people in the other country, but they tend to prop up the regime. You know, I'm convinced that but for the blockade on Cuba, the Castro regime would have crumbled at some point in the 80s. But for the oil for food boondoggle, Saddam would have never stayed in power as long as he did. You know, the sanctions are very good news for dictators. So I think we do need to reconsider diplomatically and geostrategically our relationship with Beijing. But I think that refusing to trade with them is self-defeating and ineffective. I also think that if there is going to be a diversification away from reliance on China, which I think is probably a fact of life now, I think there's a lot of people in a lot of countries saying we were too dependent on Chinese imports, we should not make the mistake of replacing reliance on Chinese producers with reliance on domestic producers, who are just as vulnerable to a local shock or disruption. The way to have security is to buy from the whole world in a diverse way.
Okay, so I think we better wrap this up here. Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Andres. It's been a great pleasure. Best wishes to you. Best wishes to everyone watching.
Yeah. Before we quick announcement. On Friday, we will be having another webinar with Said Kamal from the IEA. He'll be joining us to discuss the challenges faced by classical liberals. Sorry. And yeah, thank you everyone so much for coming. Thank you, Dan, for spending this time of the evening with us today instead of watching Dominic Cummings' interview. And yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, see you soon. Bye bye.
Vaya bien. See you soon.